bribe people to continue that craze, but rather work with alternative traffic systems. So that project also was was very fiercely fought by the inhabitants, because obviously nobody wanted that his house would be the one to be broken down. So this is like part of the analytical concepts to approach the projects we're working on. Because
water and light.
They have to do, as Alfredo said, also with resources that we find here. So water is scarce, public areas, because of the densities, are small. The reaction is that people try to collect water, that people plug themselves into existing water systems just by themselves. Normally they do this when there's no water in the tubes, then you can work, which is in some areas of the city for several weeks. There's no water.
So what he's showing us is a gunshot, and when there's no water in the tubes, they shoot into the tube, and then they connect with another pipe.
That's seriously how it is
This
done.
is the protection. Yeah. Well, it's okay. It's okay. It divides the city from the coast. All of the rainwater coming down these hills every 6 months of the year totally fills the creeks and valleys and creates a flooding down by the river, let's say the central riverbed. We've now here proposed as one of our larger scale ideas is that would be a long-term strategy rather than a tactic, which is the latrine will be more of a tactic, is to somehow create a walk at the foot of the mountain, and on that walk collect water and rainwater off the mountain.
A sort of a linear park, because curiously enough, there's a mountain which is very steep, but within the city there are almost, apart from those inner city sport fields, there's almost no open space. It doesn't exist. So there's no space to ride a bike, do anything, or have an alternative infrastructure. So this idea would not only save the water, and Caracas has more rainfall than Holland, than Rotterdam for sure. It's just distributed. Nature distributed it in a very inconvenient way for the people who live there. So there's abundance of water and floods half a year, and then it's dry.
These are one of the riverbeds that floods when the water is coming down.
But this is like,
oh, sorry.
Well, this is maybe important to point out. The density has maybe not a second effect. If you look at illumination, there's only, in this particular zone that we studied, there's only 7% of the surface where daylight hits directly the ground. If you recall those black and white figure ground plans that we saw earlier, usually in the urbanism that you know, it is 50% or more. That's what you find, what you usually find in city plans. Here you have 7%. That means if you live on the ground floor in those areas, you live in complete darkness. And that also brings with it bad ventilation, etc., etc. That's a little bit how it looks during daylight.
So this is a tactic. This is the core unit, or the dry latrine, let's say, that was built and has been approved by the Ministry of Ambience, Atmosphere, and let's say National Parks Ministry. And what it is instead of plugging in to this line of wastewater up the hill of the barrios, we're proposing to not do that because it's creating mudslides, and they should actually turn shit into gold. And what they should do is, and these are 2 buckets, let's say, and in a question of 3 weeks with a little bit of chalk, they can turn it into compost for urban agriculture on the roofs, which they already do. This is the construction of it done by us and with local people.
And that's one of them.
That's one of them, which now, over time, we haven't gone back up to this particular one, has been totally incorporated into new developments.
So this not only becomes a toilet. Normally people like smile at us if we talk about that project, but that has a bigger meaning. That is practically the unit where you have then later around it evolving a house, a unit of a house, because this infrastructure is practically not existing. You know, it takes a little introduction to understand the greater meaning of that, but also the missing wastewater system is a real catastrophe. Hydrocapital, the city water council, promised in a barrio like in Petare, in the northern part, about 400,000 people that they will get drinking water, which is, if there is water, not impossible, because the pipes that bring the drinking water to your house have a small diameter. They're using also something that you might use here rather as a garden hose, flexible tubes. They can be rolled up, and then maybe in relatively little time you have water, at least at certain points where you can walk to, which makes life easier. The problem that it brings is that there's no wastewater system. So without the wastewater system, you convert a hill, which has a very particular geological composition, in a big sand castle that will just wash down the mountain and brings all the problems of destabilization, etc.
So we won't go into this project today, but it's about electricity and turning the roofs of the barrios into solar energy. A little bit like what they do in India in Barefoot College, which you can all look up on the internet, where older women create their own solar panels.
So that is another example which has a lot to do with property, something that we actually saw on trips in many other places. We said, why is infrastructure not treated anymore by architects? You know, if you look historically, infrastructure can be a task for architects. Nowadays, who's involved in the construction of highways? Who's involved in the construction of train lines, etc.? Maybe there are not enough built anymore, but just traveling around by train in Holland, I see bridges, etc. You have one that had been obviously built here with Ben. But looking at those examples, we thought, what happens to the space underneath the highways? Caracas is a city, as we already heard, which has a tremendous three-dimensionality. That means the highways that cut through it, they either have tunnels, or they're just set solidly on the ground, or in the third case, they stand on stilts and create continuous bands of thousands of square meters of covered space. Those square meters are officially, again, in the two-dimensional understanding of the city, owned by the Ministry of Transport. Because if you roll up a city map, you just see a highway. In reality, you have thousands of cubic meters of space underneath it. So as let's say as an intervention that already found its followers, we proposed that this land should actually be given a use. In that case, we proposed in a very simple self-built means the people who run this center executed that work by themselves. We proposed a home for street children, which has a sports field on the roof, which is in consequence covered by the highway. So it has a permanent roof, which is quite useful between tropical sun, tropical rain, night, etc. It can be used very well. And we're creating this sort of sandwich that all of you know from individual buildings, putting different programs, putting different uses on top of each other. We are plugging it in existing situations. So it is not that we're building that on a vertical projected parcel of land and we program it. We rather find those situations and add and build on them. There is another project which is the first.
During the mudslides of '99 on the Vargas coast, you might have heard about it, about 150,000 dead. There were severe mudslides because the mountain obviously comes down on a face of 1,000 meters. So we thought about what if you could create some infrastructure and let people invade the building themselves. So we thought about this, which is on the poster outside, about creating some kind of growing house that kept growing, let's say, like a vertical building because of the density. And we also thought about combining that with the urban agriculture and by making certain rules, like just a little setback, maybe they could grow all along the building. And the building would actually totally be covered in green. And the Anglican Church saw our scheme and needed some relief housing, some emergency housing. These are all just introducing infrastructures on top of the barriers because you can't introduce it below and growing. So go next. And this is what we were asked to do in the Anglican Church under an existing 1950s church. This is what existed. And we were asked to create relief housing on the one hand and some community facilities on the other. So everything in orange was excavated or placed on top.